has not, even what he seems to have, be taken away. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
So one of the documentaries that I really love to watch, it's something I saw for the first time about 7 years ago. It's called The Principle. And The Principle is all about the Copernican Revolution. And so you might be familiar with the Copernican Revolution. It's the idea that when Copernicus proposed a heliocentric model of the solar system, it started a revolution in science. And it basically overturned many of the basic principles that scientists had held for a long time. It was the beginning of what people might call the scientific revolution in many ways. And so ever since that discovery, or the proposal, really it's not a discovery, it's something that many people don't realize had actually been proposed already many times. It was just that nobody had proven one way or another which model of the solar system was correct. And in fact, honest scientists today will still tell you that same thing. It's still neither of them has been proven. Stephen Hawking, a very skeptical person of Christianity and of science, he said the same thing in some of his books. But anyway, it started a huge revolution. And basically, for the last 400 years, it has caused not only a revolution in science and technology, which we can all see, but people have seen and they have believed that because of all this advancement in science and technology, we must also be advancing in virtually every realm of knowledge. Call this the Enlightenment. Historians and philosophers, they call this the idea of progress. You and I, we may not know what it's called, but we can all talk about and see how we can see this in our modern culture. That's why so many people will say things like, oh, well, that's just so old-fashioned, or that's outdated. It's this idea that basically the more we go on in society, the more progressive, the more advanced, the more enlightened and civilized we become. It's an idea that many of us take for granted. I'm bringing this up because when I entered the seminary, I learned that basically, I began to become aware of how much this had infected my thinking. And it seemed like everything I was learning in the seminary was basically reversing that whole idea. That so many ways that I thought our culture had been outdated in the past, that actually it was much more rational than I previously thought. That was one of the things I continued to learn in seminary, and that's why you guys hear me talk about our modern culture so much. Because we're influenced in many ways that we don't even realize. When I went on further in seminary and I began my theology studies, what was really interesting is I realized how much this Copernican revolution, this idea of progress, had actually infected basically all of theology in universities and colleges. Some people are often surprised, for example, when they meet somebody who has a PhD in theology or something like that, and the person will say, they don't even believe in God, or they don't believe in certain things that the Bible teaches or stories from the Bible. Right? It's because of this influence of the Copernican revolution. If all of science has become overturned, if everything else in knowledge has been overturned, then why not everything we've ever talked about in the church and in theology also gets overturned? And when I was in seminary, we actually had professors who believed this as well. So, for example, when I was learning about the Bible in my classes, we didn't actually talk about what the Bible taught. Instead, we would ask questions like, well, the Bible says this story happened, but did it really happen? Or instead of talking about, what the Gospel of Matthew is trying to portray or teach, instead we would say, well, was this chapter actually written by Matthew? Did this ever actually happen? And I guarantee you, Will Boswell, one of our Wabash students, he could probably tell you the same thing happens in his religion classes at Wabash. This is one of the reasons why, for example, sometimes I'll ask people, who wrote the book of Genesis in the Bible? And most people have no idea who wrote the book of Genesis. And yet, for 2,000 years of Christian history and Jewish history before that, everybody knew who wrote the book of Genesis. It was Moses. Moses was the author of Genesis. But in modernity, scholars begin to think, well, we just can't really believe that actually happened. Right? Surely it was written by multiple people, and et cetera, et cetera. There's this skepticism towards everything the church has ever taught. I remember learning about the lives of the saints in seminary. And instead of talking about it as history, our professor used a word called historiography. And there's a huge difference. Historiography is when you take a little parcel of a true story and you embellish it and you basically turn it into a legend. And that's how I was told to read the lives of the saints. There's all this skepticism, right, towards the history of the saints, towards the history of the Bible, towards the things that the church teaches. Now, the reason I bring all this up this morning is because one of the amazing things about the feast day that we celebrate today is a man named St. Padre Pio. And St. Padre Pio basically turns all of that stuff on its head. In the life of St. Padre Pio, he had miracles that seemed so far-fetched, so unbelievable, that if he had lived 2,000 years ago, everybody would be dismissing them. He could be in two places at the same time. He could hear confessions in all sorts of languages he had never heard before. He could read souls. His brothers in the monastery, they'd say at night that they would hear him basically like wrestling with somebody. And he was wrestling with the devil. He could see angels and demons. He had the stigmata. He bore the wounds of Christ in his body. His hands and his feet, they would bleed when he would celebrate Mass. Things that seem like a legend or a myth. And yet, he didn't live 2,000 years ago. He lived in the 1900s. He died in 1968. There are still people alive today who knew him and who are first-hand witnesses of this. When I was able to study in Rome, I was able to go to San Giovanni Rotondo where he lived, and of course the taxi who drove me around had remembered Padre Pio as a child. He had met him. It turns all of this skepticism towards theology on its head. That it really is possible for God to perform miracles like this, and for saints to be able to perform incredible miracles. And so why should we question these stories about the saints? Why should we question these stories about the Bible? St. Padre Pio is living proof to us that these things really can happen. And that's one of the reasons why I'm pretty dismissive of all the skepticism that I hear about in theology schools and in different books. So St. Padre Pio is a great example to us, and we should be grateful to God for his example of holiness, his testimony towards the supernatural, and a witness and a strength to all of us in our faith that we really can trust that God does perform miracles, even still today.